so you can be heard, see us this evening. You can't see us this evening. We are only doing audio, and when the speaker comes in, she will be doing her PowerPoint and her voice only. So live streaming is where you can be seen on the internet. So if you choose not to be on the internet, please stay in your seats and you don't have to say anything. So just enjoy the evening. We have a couple of guests here this evening from the Niagara branch, Steve Fulton and Tyler Stevens. Thank you for coming all this way. And Tim Hervey, is it? Harban, okay. So I hope you enjoy the evening. The Ontario Genealogy Society has been preserving and promoting family history for over 50 years. There are 30 branches all across Ontario. The Ontario Genealogy Society website is www.ogs.on.ca. There is lots of information on their webpage about their annual conference, membership databases, and so much more. So please go to the website and check it out. Our Kent branch is located on in the main library on Queen Street, on the second floor behind the McHugh Research Room. We are open Tuesdays to Saturdays, 1 to 5 p.m. daily. Our library is run by dedicated and informed volunteers who can help you with your research. We have a newsletter that we send out quarterly. We have monthly meetings here starting at 7 p.m. September to November and January to June. We are also on Facebook, Kent Branch Facebook group. That's www.facebook.com/group/Kent Branch OGS/. Upcoming events this month are Essex Branch OGS is having a May meeting with Veronica Mandel using newspapers and research. 7 p.m. Windsor Public Library at the lower level. May 19th, Kent Historical Society May meeting, Don Mudford, History of the Sydenham River, at 7:30 here at St. Andrew's Residence. June 12th, 2015, Kent Branch OGS June meeting, Geraldine Robertson, and she will talk on Native Institutional Schools, 7 p.m. here at the St. Andrew's Residence. The OGS Conference 2015 is May 29th to the 31st in Barrie, Ontario. The theme for it is Tracks Through Time. The website is again www.ogs.on.ca/conference/. So if you want to know any of the information about it, please feel free to go to their website and check it out. Cindy, you're going to come up and introduce Catherine. I can't wait to see this. Sounds very interesting, very intriguing. Yep. Thank you.
We're very lucky tonight to have Catherine come all the way from Windsor. She's retired from the University of Windsor, and her passion, well, I guess she'll tell us about her passion. Without further ado, Kathy,
okay,
welcome.
Well, I'm going to talk before we get started. Just further introduction to myself. I've been a practicing thanatologist since the first week of June in 1979. I've done grief counseling through Canadian Mental Health, and that took me, after 8 years with them, going back to school, doing a degree in advanced degree in religious studies, and then a graduate degree in religious studies, but in the area of thanatology. Thanatology is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. And from that experience, I ended up teaching at the university part-time in a course called The Human Meaning of Death. And of course, as most of us who have the color of hair that mine is, even though some of you probably hide yours. We probably have worn more than one hat in our lifetime. And kids nowadays have to be prepared to wear a lot of hats and have lots of different jobs. And so I ended up spending 11 years as a hospital chaplain at the same time that I was working part-time at the university. And it was a great balance. But more important than that, I'm a wife and a mother. Got flowers today. That was nice. And I have two beautiful little granddaughters, and I just got on, it's wonderful, the internet, because they live in Winnipeg, and I just got pictures, recent pictures of them on the internet today from my son in Winnipeg. So that's who I am. Oh, I'm also an ordained minister in the Anglican Church. I'm a deacon at St. Matthew's, and I've been that since September 96. So I hope that's the end of my hats. I'm done. I'm done, I think. But that's where it goes. What I'm going to do is, because there's lights on, and hopefully as I talk, if you want to say something, just, scream, shout, whistle, whatever, because I can go on for hours. And I know you have a limited time, so somebody is going to have to be the timekeeper. Okay, so let's get going with this. First of all, how many of you have experienced visitation with the casket in your parlor? Or somebody's parlor? Now, I can tell you, when I asked my elder college class yesterday morning, only 1 out of 13. So your percentage-wise is much higher. And I would guess that that's the difference between an urban setting and a more rural setting. Because rural settings tend to keep traditions and practices longer than urban settings. Okay, and that's kind of important to remember, because when the research is done using big cities and big areas, we end up getting kind of skewed things. Well, we'll go along, and you let me know whether I'm wrong in my dates, because I can tell right now you've got experiences that are more related to our topic tonight than I certainly have. I talk so much I forget what I wanted to say. Victorian times. Victorian times, and when I talk about the Victorian celebration of death, I'm talking about this lovely lady. And Victoria, as you know, was much in love with dear Prince Albert. And they had a loving, passionate marriage with lots of kids. She was the mother, the grandmother of the royalty of Europe by the time she died. But he died fairly young. And she went into mourning, full black dress. And the picture on the right is a wedding picture. And who is the central figure? Albert. The bust of Albert in marble, and the bride and the groom are sort of shoved off into the upper left-hand corner. That's the future King Edward VII and his wife, Princess Alexandra of Denmark. When we say Victorian celebration of death, what we really are talking about is all of the 19th century up until that dramatic change in death attitudes of 1914. And we all know what that is, First World War. Because in that period of time from 1814 to 1914, Europe was pretty much a peaceful place. If there were wars and conflict, they happened in the colonies or in the Crimea, which for them was in Asia, it was off there somewhere. And when we talk about our customs, I'm unapologetic about that it's European background, European, North American, same, and Christian, okay? Because if we were going to do different religious backgrounds, we'd have to look at different kinds of images and symbols. So I'm just going to talk about the dominant ones that we have based our society on. Previous to Victorian attitudes towards death, or the times of when someone you loved died, they really thought of death as something bad that came from outside, something to be frightened of. And as they were moving into the 19th century, Europeans began to think, well, death is really just part of nature. And so gradually, over this period of time, they tried to make death look as peaceful and as beautiful as possible. So that's kind of the theme. But they really felt that death was an intrinsic part of the fragile existence of nature. So here we have what I call a naturalistic monument. This was in Maitland Cemetery in Goderich. You'll notice that it's a tree stump, and there's the, I'll figure this mouse out yet. There's what we call the scroll of life, of who it is. And it's interesting that the eye up here, would wonder if possibly he was a Masonic symbol at that time. But they come in different forms so that you get some really, really wonderful ones. Is that clear enough? Is it too faded? It's okay? Okay. It looks faded to me, but that's okay. The cross is basically two logs, but isn't that a wonderful ivy and grapes that's growing on it? How interestingly it's carved. I think the one on the left is probably, if I remember correctly, it's more like a cement type of monument, quite different than some of the others. These are ordinary folk. The one on the left is what we call a bedstead grave. So you have the bed's board and the bed outlined, and then at the bottom, isn't that a wonderful flower that they have? You can put anything in that. You can put your own flowers that you bring, or this kind of thing. Now, the actual naming of who the person is really, really tiny. It's just in the center. What happened? Oh boy, that's gonna drive me crazy. There's birds as well as different kinds of flowers in that. The one on the right, again, is like the one we saw earlier. Very plain, very simple, lilies at the bottom. And one of the symbols that we will see when we look at some of the more elaborate cemeteries of Europe is that the stump is broken, which symbolizes death. Okay. I am fascinated by this one on the left. I have never seen it anywhere else but in Detroit. There's two wonderful Victorian cemeteries. If you really feel adventurous, you take the bridge, and if you want, I can email you the information with the directions and the map. And that we're supposed to do that in 2 weeks with the Elder College. And the Elder College didn't ask me, and they hired a city bus. Won't get through the gates. Won't be able to drive around the 30 acres, and this old bod's not walking 30 acres. So we're looking for a different means of walking, because this is a big cemetery, and it's right beside another one. And they were established in the 1840s. And of course, it was a garden cemetery and the wealthy folk. But the one on the left, I have never seen this anywhere else. and it's a stone with this whole story of the person's life on it, on the stump. I'd never seen that before. The one on the right is in the middle. It's a cut and brown, and I'm not sure the material that was used, if it was a red clay, but it's very interesting. Several of the monuments in Mount Elliott are like that. The one in the middle, of course, was taken by my son, who's a professor of religion at the University of Manitoba, and guess what he teaches as well? Death. He was my GA when he was taking his first degree at Windsor. So of course, whenever you get to near a cemetery, we have lots of things to share. And that one's from Colorado. Scroll of life, but look at the wonderful ferns. Aren't they great? But at this time, death was still seen as sleep. And you know, we still do that, don't we? We say rest in peace. Well, they're resting comfortably, or they're at rest, or they're peaceful. These are the kinds of things that have been going on since our Judaic ancestors, because that was their belief system. When you died, you went to Sheol and you rested until the last day. But the Victorians took that image and raised it up a bit. You have to remember that at this 100 years when they had peace, there was also the increase in two other things: the middle class, Protestantism, wealth, and the whole concept of family. And that was basically taking Victoria and her family as a model. And people wanted to keep their family together. That connection was really important. Ordinary folks were no longer marrying for economic and strategy reasons. They were beginning to marry for affection. Not necessarily the upper class, but the middle class and down. And when you have lots of time and you have some money, the ladies would be having some assistants in the home, a cook and maybe a couple of people to come in to clean the house. So they had lots of time to follow mourning practices. So it's really the females that were running the show. Again, they had Victoria to follow. But there's that little fellow in the upper left having a nice sleep with his arms crossed, and a baby's cradle down below. Those are both in graveyards. The one in the upper left is a sleeping angel, and it's found at Highgate Cemetery. Has anybody been to Highgate in London? Oh, if you're going to go and you're interested in really neat stuff, they'll give you a tour, but you have to reserve your spot. And if my husband and I have a little trick, he will distract the guide while I scurry off and get pictures of the things that they keep saying, madam, come back, come back.
You can only go through as a tour?
Yes.
And you have to pay for the tour?
Not when I was there, but that was a while ago. I wrote to them and I said, I'm coming and this is who I am, and I'd like to see some of the things that are not on the tour, and I'm teaching these people. They never responded. So when I got to London, I phoned them. Oh yes, we remember that letter. And I said, well, now wait, what do you mean? And she said, well, how do we know that you won't take a picture and publish it in a book? Well, that was a good question. The next one showed me where they were coming from. She said, and how do we know that some picture you show is not going to be an ancestor of someone that is an ancestor, and the family they're going to be upset? And that's when I knew she didn't know what her cemetery was all about. Because Victorians built monuments and cemeteries so that their loved one would not be forgotten. So the bigger the better, the more information, And you know all about that. You probably all prowled various cemeteries and looked at tombstones to get dates and names and all that kind of good stuff. Well, she just didn't get it. And I thought, something wrong there. Anyway, that's a sleeping angel. And Highgate ran out of money. They were, about the mid-70s no. They ran out of money about 70 years ago on the east side. There's two sides. There's one that's open. The east side is open and the west side is the older, interesting bit. And so when you see that tree behind the angel here, that is a sapling that has simply grown up out of the ground. It's wild. The sleeping couple down below, either a brother and sister or a mother and child, that one is marble, carved in marble, and is in a small chapel in a country church. So if you get to prowl, don't forget to go inside as well. Now, the English have an interesting attitude towards death. My cousin is at Manningtree, Iffley in Essex, and her little church, we went on a Sunday morning and we'd driven by and I'd seen this tombstone. I wanted a picture. So on Sunday I said, I'm just going to scurry down the street and get a picture of this one. She called me a necrophiliac. Well, I was so shocked. I mean, what? I thought afterwards I should have said to her, but I just want to look at the tombstone. I don't want to play with the bodies. This is nuts. Anyway, so it was when the next time she was in Canada, she brought me a little etching picture that her priest's wife had done of this tombstone. And she said, I apologize. I understand now what it was like. She tends to open her mouth and speak before really sort of engaging the brain. But it's a wonderful little picture, and I have it hanging in my Victorian guest room. Now we're going to remember this little one, this Rosalie Raymond, who is buried in Charleston in their wonderful cemetery. If you get to Charleston, South Carolina, just ask where it is. I wanted to go get a taxi and prowl it by myself, so I went into a hotel and asked, and the gentleman that was there, and he said, oh, no, you can't go by yourself. It's too dangerous, etc., etc. So I waited for my husband. We took the car and we drove around. We didn't see any. I mean, I think there were 3 people in the cemetery. Nobody goes to cemetery but people like you and me. I mean, really.
I said, except New Orleans.
Oh, well, yes, New Orleans. But sometimes we wonder about them as well. But this wonderful bronze of little Rosalie as a baby, we won't forget that. The deathbed scene in Victorian times was very different than, say, 800 or 900 years before. Although there were lots of family there wasn't the community, and there wasn't necessarily a clergy person because of the influence of Protestantism. They were no longer trying to do last-minute conversions. The Roman Catholics still wanted to have the priest to give them last rites, which we now call Sacrament of the Sick. But here are 2 wonderful images of typical death scenes at that time, where we have a young mother, wife, who's dead or dying, a person of similar age, we have no idea who she is, and then the grandma, the mother, on the left side of both pictures, and the grieving husband. One looks out the window and the other one's covering his eyes. But you'll notice that in the right-hand picture, there's a little child, because children were included. Children were included in deathbed scenes and funerals. What changed for us in Europe and in North America was the influence of the massive destruction of the First World War. And suddenly, children were being protected. We can talk about that later. You'll notice that she's obviously died in childbirth. I have a guess don't know for sure, but I have a guess that those are co-joined twins or Siamese twins, just because of the way they're placed, but they could be just twins. I keep forgetting I added all these things, sorry. So even the children are included. And you know, until I was actually working in the Windsor Hospital in the early 90s, children under 12 were not really welcome at all in the hospitals, even when their mums and dads were dying, and that was really, really hard. We worked really hard to get that changed so that they could be included. But for 100 years, almost 100 years, children were excluded. And unfortunately, they're still being protected sometimes by family. They don't need to be, oh, wrong way, okay. Next, no, all right. These are 3 that I found. The one in the upper left is at Kensal Green. And if you get a chance to get to England and London and you want to spend a nice day, you can go to Kensal Green Cemetery. It's still being used. It was the first Victorian cemetery in England. It was established in 1832. And they have princes and princesses and all kinds. I'm going to be showing you lots of monuments from there. And this one at the top, where you have 2 grieving women over a gentleman who's dying, is on a panel in the cemetery. Colonel Edgerton, he is being grieved by others. And then we have the whole image here of the woman who's dead and her little soul. Little souls were always imaged as naked, asexual humans. And there's the wonderful angel taking her up to heaven. So it tells us a lot about what happened and what the belief system is. Now, trying to keep everybody together was a really important thing. My great-grandfather, James Smith, who had a farm outside of Bothwell, he bought a plot of 8 in the cemetery in London, and the name of it's gone out of my brain at the moment. And my grandmother thought that was fine. He was buried there, his wife was buried there, and his eldest daughter was buried there. But my grandmother, the in-law, or outlaw at that moment, decided she did not want to spend eternity next to the sister-in-law that she didn't like. And so she and my grandfather have a double plot, and they are buried elsewhere in the same cemetery. I've often wondered what has happened to those other 5 plots. But what we can see is that in different parts of the world in Victorian times, they wanted to keep the family together. So on the one on the left, you have the love knot or the affection knot going around the edge of that crypt plot. And then the one on the right is a very large family plot and has a fence with a gate. But you'll notice that there are several kinds of monuments in there, put in at different times. I had a gentleman yesterday morning was very concerned about how he was going to get all the names onto the one monument that was in the 8 plot sized family plot that they have up in the Ottawa Valley. And so I showed him a picture with several things. I said, well, you can try something different. You can add something else. You don't have to stick with the one, kind of thing. How many of you have family plots or family? Are they full or have you got spots? Oh, it's full. Okay. You have an 8.
5 and 6.
Okay. You got that written down somewhere?
Our names are on it already.
Oh, excuse me. Good for you.
Oh, eventually it's gonna happen.
Well, and that's the point.
Everybody knows now my age.
Yeah, first year's on it.
Yeah, it's something that for some people is very important, and for others it doesn't matter at all. You know, it just depends on how many of you here you go and visit graves of your loved ones. Oh dear, I am in the minority here. I'm not a great visitor, so, and I don't think my boys will be either. So I think that they'll be fine. They will just be able to figure something out. We're not even going to try to go to the family one at this point. But in Victorian times, they had wonderful mausoleums. And some of them, one of the earliest ones is at Castle Howard in Northern England. And that's the one in the upper right. And you can't, that was a zoom in as close as I could get to it, but it is absolutely huge and gorgeous. And the family is buried there on their estate. Other kinds of mausoleums, the one at Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit is the one on the left, upper left. And I believe that it's self-standing. If you ever go to Goderich, where I was raised, and go into the Maitland Cemetery, which is neat because it's got some of those early white pioneer, and it's got all of the, I mean, if we could take a trip and do that one, there's all kinds of stuff in there, from early pioneer right through the Victorians, through the people of after the Second World War who didn't want to acknowledge that death happened at all, and right up to some of the really interesting stuff that's happening now in a different way. So mausoleums were huge, but in Maitland, they've built them into the side of the riverbank, which is very interesting. And they've done the same thing at the Glasgow Acropolis, if you're ever at St. Giles Cathedral there. The one on the lower right is huge with bronze doors, angels guarding the doors. And you can peek in that one. And that's in Brompton Cemetery, again in London. The one on the left is Colorado. So you see how it's fitted, it's different locations and different amounts of money spent and all of the above. Now this is the Eaton Mausoleum at Mount Pleasant. How many of you have prowled Mount Pleasant? Oh, you gotta go to Mount Pleasant. The other interesting one is the Toronto Necropolis. Have you been to that one as well? Okay, good. We got some nodding of heads. That's a great one to go to as well. But this is the Eaton family mausoleum with two lions guarding and very much the Grecian sort of theme. Greek and Egyptian themes were huge in the memorial monuments that the Victorians used in their garden cemeteries. Now, in Christianity, it became, there was a death attitudes change that changed from where everybody dies, we're all part of the community, everybody dies, then, oh my goodness, after the Black Death, I'm gonna die. I wonder if I got my last rites. Okay, that is a big change. And gradually then into Victorian times where you're gonna die. My loved one is going to die. And of course, now because we have emotional attachment, there's great sadness. So here we have two widows grieving the loss of the spouse. One is, they're both exterior, outside. Now, cherubs were huge in Victorian monuments. And I don't know if you can see him very well, but up here, if I can get this thing to work. He has a hanky to wipe his tears away. And there's another one, so sad. This monument, this little fellow is life-size. And the monument covers a whole wall of a chapel, which is at least 20 feet tall. And there's this little fellow on one side, and on the other side, another little fellow. Adult angels cry too. And even the swans in Père Lachaise in Paris. Has anybody been to that one? It's still in use. Yeah, fascinating. I mean, some of the elaborate stuff, it's amazing. This is called the Blue Angel. And the Blue Angel was first done in Père Lachaise, but it has been picked up by many of the other Victorian cemeteries. There's one in New Orleans. I believe there's another one in the eastern states somewhere. I'm not sure exactly which one, but so common that monument makers copied. They didn't have copyright in pictures in those days. And here we have a lady up at the top who's grieving the death of her husband. And here she is, a widow with 3 little ones. Makes you wonder, I wonder who's going to look after her. That's an expensive monument. That is hugely expensive monument. How is she going to survive? I ask those kinds of questions. The one with the sleeping on the lady sleeping on the piano, she is just sad. And the lady leaning on the tombstone of Brown, the Brown tombstone, she, that's Mount Pleasant. You can find all kinds of things when you go prowling. The Victorians used various symbols to represent death. Have any of you had to wear armbands, black armbands? Okay. You're from England? Okay. What part of England, may I ask? Ah, yes, the North Country. Do they still pull the drapes when someone dies? I learned that when I was doing grief counseling, and I went to visit a young woman whose mother had died in England, and she was so upset because she pulled all the drapes in her house and nobody came to offer their condolences. And she was shattered. Only the people across the street, because they happened to know and talk to her, knew what had happened. And yeah, so when we have those cultural differences, and that's a cultural difference. It's not a religious difference. There is a difference between religion and culture. That's one of the things. And she made her husband wear a black armband. This is 1980s in Windsor. And the mourning wreath would be black and put on the door. What color would it be if a child had died? White. The broken column of life was such a typical symbol that they used. And with the mourning, the flowers from the mourning wreath going up. If you look at that, that's what Highgate looks like since they ran out of money to keep the cemetery neat and tidy. I know that at one time I went to a cemetery with my cousin who was raised in London. He didn't even know it existed. We went and we found it. I'll show you pictures of it in a bit. And we walked in and we were the only people in this place. And it was 52 acres. And the trees had grown and there were paths going in between. And I'm taking pictures and we're looking at the paths going into this overgrown. Finally, it got a little dark and he said, "Are we leaving now?" A little spooky, folks. But at least we were free to spend as much time as we wanted. Some of the other symbols that you'll see as you wander around is the mourning wreath again. Not sure what the pomegranates are about, but the doused torch of life. If you turn a candle upside down, it goes out. So that's the symbol of the doused torch. And pointing up to heaven is the belief system. They're going to go to heaven. And then we have the flowers. Lilies were big and others were big too. But pointing the finger to heaven was huge. The other thing that you'll see a lot in Victorian tombstones, more in the ordinary folks rather than the people that have these marvelous alabaster and marble monuments. But the ordinary folks would have clasped hands. Now, if you know anything about Victorian customs, ladies were always to wear gloves. The bare hand was considered, skin was considered. Didn't do that. That was just over the top. It was not done. So they had gloves, but here we have bare hands, a man's hand and a woman's hand. Huge for the Victorians as a sign of affection. And these three are from the States and Canada and England. So it's a symbol that has gone all over the place as the whole idea of Victorian cemeteries happened. There was a belief system after the Black Death that when you died and went to heaven, you were going to be judged then, not on the last day when Jesus came back, but when you died, a moment of death judgment it was called. And who was going to meet you at the gate? No, sorry. St. Michael, the Archangel. St. Peter, sorry about that. St. Peter is a Protestant invention. So we're going to have St. Michael is going to meet you at the gate, and he's going to examine your imaginary book of life. And it's sort of like a bank balance where you've got all the good on one side and all the naughty on the other side. So you have your actions and your words and your thoughts. Now, most of us can control our actions, not always so good about our words, but our thoughts, that's a real toughie. So that whole idea of the Book of Life has continued on into Victorian times. So here we have an angel, even with a quill, going to make the judgment. And then the lady on the right side reading the book and leaning on a trunk of a tree, monument cross. I had said before that some of the symbols that were huge for Victorians was the Greek and the Egyptian themes. So you'll see lots of pyramids, you'll see some sphinxes. But one of the things that you see, and we see it a lot even in our little smaller cemeteries in Ontario, is the Grecian urn covered with a shroud. Okay, just the edge of a shroud. Here's two, again, this is Highgate and the broken column, but again, we have those urns. Douse torch, this is a great one. I really like this one because look how many of the symbols it has. The wreath, clasped hands, douse torch, and a covered urn. And then down the sides of the monument itself, there's lots of room to write the story of who's in this plot. But sometimes they even had symbols of trees that were sad because the Victorians visited their loved ones. They went to visit them. They took their lunch and they made a day of it. It was an outing. So when they designed these, garden cemeteries, what happened was in Europe, many of the early cemeteries were right next to the churches so that people could be buried as close to the sacred place as possible. And they got full. They got unsanitary. You have to remember that until 1666, it was any kind of a hole you could make. They didn't make the rule 6 feet under until 65, when the last Black Death hit London. And then they made the rule 6 feet down, which is where that comes from. So they got unsanitary. And of course, you have the growth of money, and people decided, well, maybe we can have a public cemetery not connected to a particular denomination. And it would be outside of the urban area, away from where people lived and not connected to churches. And of course, they sold plots. Now, you've heard about that because we do that now here. But sometimes you'll see them referred to as garden cemeteries as well, because they were planned to look like beautiful places to visit. Again, like those Elysian fields where they could walk with graceful trees and bending walkways. And if they could get it to go up and down, that would be great. But they're not very wide. So that city bus isn't making it into Elmwood. There is no way it's getting even around the first corner. I couldn't believe it, actually. But it had to be easy access for visitation. And remember, they started in the 1830s. And they exploded both in other parts, started in France, and exploded all around Europe and in North America. And within 20 years, there were lots and lots and lots of them all over the places in urban areas. Kensal Green was 1833, and here is a plan of their cemetery. And so we have a central circle and winding paths. Here is the road from London. You can't see it here, but it says canal. So you could get to it by canal. You could get to it by road. And then within 10 years, the railway went through and it goes right on the other side of the road. So it's not difficult to get to if you're going to visit. And if you're going to sell property, you're going to sell plots, you have to have pamphlets, right? And you have to have pictures of how it's going to look. So here we have the road from London, the canal on that side, and the gates. The advertisements for Kensal Green. And these were published in 1834 in a penny magazine. And they talked about what the colonnade for the catacombs could be. If you didn't want to buy a piece, you could go under the ground and be buried in the catacombs like the early Christians. This is one at this side, the bottom, where it shows the non-Anglican chapel. And you see all the families coming to visit. I was lucky enough to get actually a copy of this, and it hangs in my office. Because of course you need to have that kind of stuff. If you're in my business, I've got Puritan tombstones in my bathroom. Replicas, small ones. And here's another picture as how they saw it was going to go up to the Anglican chapel with a Victorian hearse going in. And these, just imagine if you had the money and you wanted to be buried near Princess Charlotte. Well, my goodness, what a thing to have that. If you could afford it and get your name in there at the big place first. So Kensal Green was very popular and it's still being used. These are 4 monuments on the main section of Kensal Green. This is a lady and there's 4 angels pointing to heaven from 4 different directions. This gentleman down here had been a general in the Indian Army, and he has green marble pillars on the inside and pink marble pillars on the outside, and his sarcophagus is here raised up. Now, interesting, if you really want to see something Victorian and you get to Calcutta, check out their Victorian cemetery. Big. This gentleman was the inventor of the postage envelope, and he was an artist. So here we have his palette with paints, but he was the inventor of the postage envelope. And all these folks are in this wonderful laneway where all these magnificent monuments stand. The Glasgow Acropolis, the cathedral's over here on the left. You walk across a bridge to get to the necropolis, and it's still there. You can wander around. We were there on a very dark, cloudy day. My husband disappeared. And all these mausoleums that were built into the side of this hill had gates, like big steel gates, modern, put in with big red signs, do not enter, danger of collapse. Except that many of them were pulled aside and there were sleeping bags inside because the homeless were sleeping in them. And my husband's somewhere I don't know, and I'm a chicken because I don't know how to get out of there. But that's what the top looks like. You see, it's not much different than the engraving, is it? The top of it. Marvelous place. But that's where they're built into the side. Here's Nunhead. And Nunhead was the one that my cousin Michael didn't even know existed. So he and I went off to Nunhead to have a look at it. And it was a forgotten one for a long time, but that was their advertisement. And there are the gates as they are today. Still there, they cleaned them up. There's friends of each of these cemeteries and they tidy up, get all the soot from the coal burning fires that they used to have in England. But all that's left of this chapel is just the arch at the top. And they cleaned out the streets so that you can walk along the streets, but in between, not much. Brompton Cemetery, I would really suggest if you're in London, have a look at that one. It's a little bit later in Victorian times. It's between two main streets and has a main avenue with flowers, has two sections with catacombs, and then it has a chapel at the end. And people will ride their bikes or jog through there to get from one of these main streets to the other. And it's still being used. We actually witnessed a funeral of a child while we were there. And of course, because of who I am, they don't have funeral homes as we know it. The funeral directors were there with the hearse and the casket for about half an hour. And I said, this is who I am, and this is why I'm here. And do you really mind if the family is not expected immediately? May I take a picture of you? Because one gentleman, the funeral director, had his black top hat and his morning suit and the whole bit. And the assistant was not wearing a hat because he was the assistant, the driver, I think, if I remember correctly, because we saw them walking down with the family. And he said, oh, yes. And then, of course, all you have to do is ask a funeral director about something, and they're off. I mean, they'll tell you about everything. So he told me about 3 other cemeteries I had to visit. Anyway, here's Brompton. Here's the avenue of wonderful trees that they see in the pictures, just little ones. They're huge. They're just beautiful. Here is the back gate, and I have that etching framed on my office wall. And here's the other gate at the front, at the beginning. That's where the cars go through now. I have never seen so many angel monuments in one place in my life. The whole side between the catacomb area and the chapel down here are all angels in various stages of, there's an angel putting a wreath on a cross, praying, just on and on and on, just amazing. This is a picture of how you get into the catacombs. You go down below and the door is iron. And of course it's chained and bolted. It's a wide open park. And that's the chapel. Here are the angels and the catacombs down below. Highgate Cemetery is probably the one on the west side, Highgate West, is the one that is known in England as the high one, the biggie, where all the people want to be. They wanted to be able to go and visit their loved ones and have a wonderful view. So it's up on a hill. And there's a tree of Lebanon in the middle. And what they did was they dug around the tree of Lebanon, and they had steps going down at one side, and a colonnade, they call it the Egyptian colonnade. So here are family mausoleums built into the side of the wall. All around the edge are family mausoleums. Of course, I was all ready to go in, right, with my camera. Madam, come back. You're not allowed in there. Oh, I was annoyed. I wanted to get some pictures, but they were doing restoration. It was a 2-hour tour, and to get me through this one, it would have probably taken about 4 or 5. So she was probably right. But that's what I was able to catch, was just what I could kind of peeking in, see some of these wonderful mausoleums that they were fixing the doors and doing repairs, the Friends. It's a volunteer organization. I wandered down this path and got called back to see that one. That's the garden. You can see I'm at the back of the bus here walking down, and this looks like Godrich, frankly, with the mausoleums built into the side of the hill and the road. Now here, what we see at Highgate is what the Friends are doing. They're cutting back the vines and cleaning the monuments so that this pyramidal, or this, what are those things called? Thank you, needles. That would be white originally too. Isn't this Thornton one wonderful? I had to get that one off the internet, but that's at Highgate as well. That's one of the ones I wanted to actually get a picture of, but there might have been a Thornton in my class, and don't go there. Anyway, the Americans followed as well as, go back, stop that, don't touch it. As well as Mount Pleasant did as well. Mount Pleasant originally was on the outskirts of the city. Well, as we know now, it's right downtown, built around. Well, so is Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. And their plans for it were absolutely amazing. But again, on a huge scale, you're not going to forget the people that are buried in these places, ever, ever, ever. Because the theme was that the souls would be reunited in an endless cycle of nature, and it would prolong the earthly affection for eternity. And that's where it comes from, that when we get to heaven, we're going to recognize our relatives. It's not what the Bible says, but that's what we'd like to believe. And that brings comfort, that we'll know who they are and we'll be able to see them. And so that whole theme of wanting to be connected, so that the hands, the pointing to heaven, the whole idea was to keep the memory of the loved one alive. And they did it in their monuments, the clasped hands, the fence around the edge, by actually having a profile of the person who died, the grieving widow, the angel pointing to heaven. This is a wall monument in a cathedral, 1791. Mount Pleasant, the angel. Lots of crosses, all with nature, all different kinds. I like the birds up here. And angels, lots and lots of angels. Now, I'm not quite sure what this angel is supposed to be doing. I think she's collecting tears, but I'm not sure. But she definitely has a basin and a praying angel. And here we have Brompton's Avenue of Angels, Highgate's angel, an angel pointing up to heaven on a cross, another one with a doused torch and pointing. This one, what I found in a little village in Somerset. It was in a churchyard, and it was the only monument in the whole churchyard that was fancy. So obviously that was somebody important, or somebody with money. They're not always the same. Interesting, this one, Triumphant Angel. You wouldn't want to run into him in the dark. What we know about Victorian times is that they could talk about death, and they could celebrate death, and they could do everything about death, but you didn't talk about sex. That was a no-no. So if we take a look at the progression of some of these monuments, we can see what happens with their thought. At first, the angels, and I'm going to go back one if I can. No, wrong way, wrong way. Okay. This is an asexual angel. This is an asexual angel. This is an asexual angel. Most of them are asexual here. We move on to this one, and all of a sudden, ooh, I can see that leg. Ooh. The ladies aren't supposed to show their legs, right? There's the leg. Oh my, then we got 2 legs. Oh, and some breasts. Bare arms. Oi, getting bad. And then, of course, this one's up at Mount Pleasant, and this little angel's losing part of her dress. She's got a bare shoulder, and we begin to see that these angels are not the asexual angels that are talked about in theology, but the angels with bodies. And, of course, the French. So 2 bare legs and Pierre Lecaisse. And it wasn't long before these angels lost their wings. And they moved into just women, usually in Grecian outfits, because of course then you could have the drapery on the bodies, because if you've seen Gone with the Wind, you know that Scarlett wore a hoop skirt that went out 1,000 feet and all of that, etc., etc. But here we have this lady with fairly well-developed upper section, and her leg is showing. This monument is in the Victorian and Albert Museum in London. If you get a chance to look at, they're wonderful. They've got a whole room full of this kind of stuff. And here is a woman putting a flower into a flower pot, and we are getting lots of images of her body. South Carolina, Charleston, little girl. When you go into Kensal Green, you walk through the gate, go in about, maybe 20 feet, look right, and there she is, this one. My husband says the first time we went to Kensal Green, he said, I went off like dust. And he and my cousin Michael sort of tromped along behind, because they were more interested in what was written on the monuments. I didn't care what was written on the monuments. I wanted to see what the monuments were, what symbols were they being used. This one is at Mount Elliott in Detroit, and I have never seen such a relaxed person before on a monument. How many women of Victorian times would cross their legs like that? I don't think they ever would, but it just struck me as, well, it just tells us something. And of course, the French. Pierre Lecaisse. They are not as inhibited as the old Protestants of the Anglo-Saxon variety, of which I am descended from. But Charleston, South Carolina. Little girl, I think. When they were having a cemetery, having a funeral, they would send out a notice. And so there is a funeral notice for Elder Osborne, and another one, the special service that was held in Westminster Abbey for Queen Victoria. My eyes after cataract surgery are still fighting with each other. I think that says 1901. Was wondering whether it was a 1 or a 3. And then we have the whole idea of what Canada did for Queen Victoria's death. And when you received an envelope with a black border around the edge, that was a death notice, and you knew that. And postage came 6 days a week, and sometimes twice a day, depending on whether you were in an urban area or a rural area. And I have a wonderful collection of those because my grandmother kept them all. She was born in 1874, so she got them all, and I snatched them. And then I was in England and in our antique shop, and I saw a basket full of them, and I thought, I'll have some of those. So I went through and I picked out like one for each year. And after we got out of that town in a way, I thought, well, that was silly. I should have brought the whole thing because nobody else will get them. They throw those things out. Death avoidance is huge in Great Britain. Funeral services were to be simple and moving. They would be announced through invitation or death announcements. Now we use the internet and we use newspaper obituaries. Okay, I see my time. Thank you. Whoops, wait a minute, what happened? Oh, wait. How many of you visited the Huron County Pioneer Museum in Goderich? I went to grade 1 in that building. But they have a wonderful funereal display because they have for children and for adults, they have for summer and winter. Winter hearses are sleds. Children's hearses are white. Adult hearses are black. And they have samples of all of those as well as some. The picture in the top left is an actual photograph of a young baby in its coffin and casket. The coffin at the bottom is the shape that the Europeans still use, and it was what's used in early pioneer times. More room for the shoulders. Processions were solemn. Here we have 4 little girls carrying a child's coffin, probably a sibling, and the mom and the dad and the grandpa. It's the image that's been painted. Sometimes they would use a coffin cart, such as we see the children using there. Some were simple hand carts. And I found this in a little country church in England, and these are called the Coffin Stools. So instead of those nice little things that we use here on wheels, you know, that fold up and stick in the back of the hearse, they would stay in the church and they would put them apart, and the coffins are carried on the shoulders. They don't have handles, and then they're put down on the cart in the church. This one could be used with assistance from an animal, probably a horse, maybe a donkey, depending on what people had. These I found in churches. However, Victorian times is coming back. And I was sent this one at Windsor Grove, where a family member was buried using an old Victorian hearse. Now you can rent them in South Carolina and use them. You can rent them all over England now, but this one was at Highgate on the east side. This photograph is a picture of a Victorian procession, and I'm watching my clock. I know I'm at an hour. And I love this photograph because everything is black. The horses are black. The plumes on the horses' heads are black ostrich feathers that have been dyed black, and the funeral director will be there. A long, long procession with all these wonderful carriages. But the people that would go in front of the procession would be these gentlemen. They would be one of the jobs that a deaf mute could be employed for. Because instead of having a police car going along in front, which we often do for important funerals, these people would go along the road and let you know that there's a funeral coming, but nothing could distract them because they couldn't hear any sounds. So their job, they could be solemn and plain. This is, of course, for an adult funeral and for a child's funeral. This one is the funeral of a procession of a duke in England. So here we have all the ladies in appropriate mourning clothes and the gentlemen have taken off their hats, and all these relatives are walking along behind. Notice they're all male. And the hearse is coming along and going off to the mausoleum. Same year, in the colliery, in a coal mine, there was a terrible disaster and a number of miners were killed. So here we see the carts being led, and there's several coffins piled up on each one. But here we see ordinary folks, but still standing as solemn as they could along the edge and watching the procession. So even the folks who didn't have a lot of money still emulated the higher folks. Of course, we don't do that, do we? Of course we do. We're all affected by the propaganda of our media. And of course, Queen Victoria's procession. We come back to Victorian times. So here we have the next king and all of the royalty. You notice the men are coming first and the women are walking afterwards in the widow's weeds with black veils and black clothing. Graves were visited. New Orleans, an iron bench. This one I found in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and it's a naturalistic tombstone, but a bench right behind so you could come and sit and visit with your loved one. But the idea was to keep the memory alive. And so here we have a woman who dies in childbirth at sea and memorialized by her husband when he got back to Gloucester Cathedral. Here's two men, two soldiers who were killed, and their profiles and an angel. Not going to forget those elaborate monuments. Sweden. Don't often find male angels, but here's a couple of male angels. And this is Bavaria. So it was all over. Big monuments. Not quite sure what that little angel was doing over top the sleeping couple, but there they are. And the crying angel that I showed you earlier. Huge. These are huge, massive. You won't forget them. A bishop, all the actions that he did as a bishop, alabaster, two angels covering him with his shroud. But one of the things that we did Victorian times towards began in the early 1700s, but became very popular in the last 40 to 60 years of the 19th century. And that was to try to keep an incorruptible fragment of the loved one alive. And they did it through pictures. This one, the gentleman was a potter for Wedgwood, and he had done a little small image of his daughter on her birthday. And then 6 months later, she died. And so he did another one before she was buried. So that's in her death. But they did take pictures of bodies in those days. And even up until now, in some parts of North America and in Europe, pictures are taken of the person in the body and sent to the family on the other side of the ocean so that they can be part of it. It was so typical that they did that. So we have ones done by professionals. Here's a Mexican one and another professional one, and then you get simple ones. But you would have to have a photographer come in, especially for the daguerreotypes. Here's one from a funeral service in Muncie, Indiana. And of course, that would be sent back to home country. An Italian student of mine brought me a book, and this was part of what the Italians did. And then a small child. Lots of mementos. And of course, we have prayer cards still, but they don't kind of go into the details. And we certainly don't have the wonderful cutouts that were available in those days. Memorial notices. I've got a ton of those. One of them even has a picture of the person who died, which I think was rather unusual for the 1890s. from my grandmother's trunk. Grandmother's trunks are wonderful. But if you really, really wanted to keep an immortal fragment of your loved one alive, you would have a piece of their hair or a photograph. And it could be woven into a ring, hidden behind a brooch. This one would have it behind there. The locket would be inside. And in the early days, the pallbearers, the 4 pallbearers, would be given a memorial ring that just said in memory and then would say who it was. And you can imagine that after a while, that could be quite expensive. So they moved to the people who could afford really fancy things would have those. This was my grandmother's brooch, and that's my great Aunt Bessie's hair. There's a piece in the front and a piece in the back. She wore it so much that the pin was gone and one of the back side of the brooch's glass is broken. That was hers. My grandmother's was a plain gold brooch, and the hair from her sister Bessie was hidden behind that. So when you go to some of these antique places and you see jewelry, just turn them over. You might find one of these pieces of memorial. They can be very expensive. They can be quite reasonable in price. They're wonderful. Just have a look on the internet. Viewing at home, but then you all know about that because you told me about that earlier. In the parlor, was it scary?
No.
Just normal? What you were used to? Okay. Even as a child?
Didn't like it.
You didn't like it. Did anybody talk to you about it while it was happening? No, of course not. You were supposed to get it by osmosis. That was the beginning of the protecting of the children. Well, my mother said, well, why are you having difficulty with grieving? I took you to all those funerals. Yeah, but she didn't put any words to the events, and she didn't encourage questions. And so I would sit there in the family section of the funeral home. You remember the little room off to the side? And we waited for the person in the box to sit up. And when I got bored, I had to be taken out and run a stick up and down on the graveyard fence because I was bored. I was 6. Different world. This painting, this etching, is called The Last Look. And that would be where the family would have their last look at the body in the casket before it was closed, before the funeral. So here we have the mama and the wife and all the children. It's called The Last Look. It's gorgeous. Hangs on the wall in my office. Now, what did they wear? Well, after the War of 1814, the Parisian fashion books came out, and this was the kind of thing you had. And they had these kinds of outfits. You finally got to see pictures. You could get drawings. There were instructions about what kind of fabric you should wear, and if it was a widow, she had to have this kind of fabric, and if it was a child, it was this kind of fabric, and how long you would wear this color, and so forth and so on. You went from black to dark purple to light mauve to dark gray to light gray. My mother couldn't stand purple. Not much, I guess. So here's another one that tells you the different kinds of acceptable. Doesn't that look like Gone with the Wind, kind of? And a parasol, and a fan, and a pocketbook, and widow's weeds. Widow's weeds. But they did advertising. So you could look up in the paper and see where you could go. If you had a sudden death, you could go to Jay's Mourning Warehouse on Regent Street, and you could be all fitted out. And Peter Robinson's also had court and family mourning and black goods warehouse, again on Regent Street. Still take money to go shop on Regent Street. But in Ohio, they also had fine memorial goods. So these are things that were in magazines and papers, and you would hang on to that just in case you might need them. Fashions for 1889. Jay's must have had been pretty big business. I see I've got 3 advertisements from them. These I found fascinating because these are like cards. You know how you give an office business card out? So here we have business cards, but here's an invitation as well, a bill from the Furnishing Undertakers and Memorial Sculptures, and for £1.10. Wouldn't that be nice if we could get a monument for £1.10? What's that, about $3? Yeah, and not happening. Just fascinating. Anyway, questions?
One thing I was wondering about was, I think they're called casket plates. Was that in the Victorian time too?
You mean on the casket
Well, I
itself?
bought some at an antique shop once.
Uh-huh.
That's what they explained, that there was a, well, I think it was tin, and the name was on it, so they must have taken those off before they.
Not necessarily. Some might have, but some they would have been buried with. It depends. And it wasn't common always, because you're gonna have a monument, big one. It's amazing how much money people spend on monuments to remember people.
The black and the purple and the this and the that.
The progression.
Was that all across the board? Because the ones I remember, particularly my French grandmother, my mother and her 6 sisters went through this, and I was so sick of looking at black, and then I got sick of purple. And the kids, the girls in particular, had to do it as well. So, but they were French, so I just assumed it was a French custom, but it wasn't.
No, it was all over.
Ah.
All over, anywhere where Victoria and that whole idea of beautifying death. If we make it look good, it won't hurt so much.
Okay. So the
And
English did it, and the Germans did it.
The colonists out in Calcutta did it, and Egypt, all over where the Brits and the Europeans traveled around the world, and they did it. The interesting part is that with the 2 world wars, we went through about 90 years where all of this mourning and mass death was too much. It wasn't beautiful. It was awful. So if you go into some of these cemeteries, where we get the flat cemeteries, and where we get just a stone that will say the person's family name, might be upright, and then in the plot there's nothing around, and it'll just say first name and the birth and the death date. So it doesn't help people who are looking for their story, does it? You want to get those Victorians. But what's interesting, at least in Windsor, on those flat cemeteries, 75% of the new plots are for vertical monuments. And now they're doing etchings. They're doing computerizing, putting things in. They're very elaborate. They can be absolutely amazing monuments that you can see. Etchings actually of people as they were taken from a picture that an artist has done. We've returned to that Victorian stuff because death doesn't happen all the time in our lives anymore. Sorry.
I noticed in our local cemetery where we have people of European ethnic, they were actually immigrants. We quite often see actual photos on stuff.
Yes, exactly. But we see that in on Howard Avenue in Windsor, at Windsor Grove. You go up, right, all the upright tombstones, just one after another, and they're usually Ukrainian, Polish, Eastern. Yeah.
I have the deed of the grave where my grandparents are buried in England. It
Wonderful.
was sent to me. They were buried one on top of each other.
Mhm.
And there is a child in there too, although it's not on the deed. And there is room for 2 more. But
Well, there you go, you're all
nobody
set.
can be buried there because I've got the deed.
Oh, you could.
No, I'm.
We had a huge discussion about this and who owns the land and who owns the plot at that elder college yesterday morning.
The other thing that have seen, and I've seen it several times, is not just a brooch or a ring made of Bedstead, but a huge wreath.
Yes. But some of those aren't always memorials because they saved their hair and they had hair things, and that was one of the crafts that they did.
Yeah.
So those hair wreaths and hair jewelry that's made of hair are not necessarily memorials.
They are beautiful.
They are gorgeous. Again, Huron County Pioneer Museum has a bunch. Yes.
You had mentioned that they were shown in homes. When did they start showing them in funeral homes, and when that comes about, and why? How did how
Because the death became, with the First World War, it became, and particularly in Europe, because it happened in somebody's backyard. They made it as easy as possible. In Britain, they often don't have a viewing at all. You meet either at the church where there might be a burial, or you can even meet at the cremation site where there'll be a service. And the coffin will go right into the crematorium and push button and it goes. Yes.
This may be somewhat related to the question over here, but we have got they're uncommon around here, and yet they're here. A shaft that goes down generally about 8 feet, and they're one on top of the other with a flat piece on top. Do you know when that?
Yeah, and we saw those started to develop in Britain, and some of the ones that I showed pictures of, there's big rings and they lift it up and it's like an underground crypt.
Do you know when that began? I think it ended.
The first ones I saw were from the early 1700s
Okay.
in graveyards. Because that's when they stopped using common graves in that period of time.
Yeah, okay.
And individualism started to rise. Because before that, everybody was part of a group, a big group, not just a family. Time for one more, because I know you're. One more.
I just wanted to ask about a different level of people back then, the farmers.
Mhm.
Now, was it during this time that they were buried right on the land?
Yes, and I remember my mother telling me as we were driving along Highway number 2, back of Athens somewhere, near the Thames River, and she said, my great-grandparents are buried under that new highway. Because they weren't marked always. They were just buried on the edge of the property. And that would have been well over 100 years.
And that would go back into those times too.
Oh, yeah. And that's why many families are trying to keep those pioneer cemeteries or family cemeteries alive and fixing them. Kind of
Number
important.
3 highway, that's
Oh.
all kinds.
All kinds of, yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Oh, that's okay. Well, on behalf of the branch, we'd like to give you a little token. Thank you very much. Catherine's going to stay around, so
Oh,
if you
yeah,
have
I'll
any
be
more
around.
questions during break time, definitely catch up with her and ask away. So,
Just want to make sure I can get out of here. I'll do that after.
say goodbye to the folks online.
Okay, we'll finish up and ask your questions, and we'll take a 20-minute coffee break before we have our general meeting. And please, yes, clap for Catherine. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It was very good, very good. Thank you.